Mark, thank you very much indeed. We've got just over 20 minutes, and I think the best way of doing this is if I sort of land on a first hand I see, and then we just see if there are 2 or 3 other people who've got things in the same general area of subject matter before we move on to something else. And I have to say the first one I saw was back here.
Thank you.
Introduce yourself as well.
In view of the fact that I'm aware that there's many under 25s that have been affected by the legislations being brought in, whereby they're only allowed half of housing benefit when on benefits. How is this going to help them to stay off the streets? Because they can't afford to stay where they are. Some of them, one in particular I know, has had to move back in home and is sleeping on the settee of a house that is already overcrowded because there's actually no room in the bedrooms, considering the size of the bedrooms, to have another bed in there for her. So she's sleeping on her mum and dad's settee, and yet the legislation that's in place says this is not overcrowding because she could share her room with a sister. Impossible.
Anybody got anything else in that same sort of general area? No? Right.
So I'll just tackle that briefly.
Yes.
I mean, I think there's a complex set of issues there. There is a change in the law. Sofa surfing is something that does take place quite a lot. That's partly to do with the way, frankly, the owner-occupation market has, people who buy has got expensive. People are moving back in with mum and dad. What we've looked to do, Crisis have a very good single-person, homeless persons program, which we've put about 10 million into. We're putting an additional £1 million into that because what we're finding when we're looking, it seems to be quite localized in certain areas, particularly around the issue of work. I mean, the key thing is getting them into work where they're able to earn so that they're actually above the housing benefit level. That's crucial. But I take your point, which is that the combination of those effects means that for some people they are being pinched by this. But we are looking to increase that funding to make sure that actually sofa surfing doesn't become the norm. Yes, what we're trying to work through with Crisis is to make sure, because they've got a very good program, they've been able to turn around a substantial number of young people's lives in that context. So the extra $1 million that we're putting in place is something that actually they already have in train. But it may be worth, perhaps if you, we'll get the local contact details for you so you can have a look at that.
One of the things that comes out of that is where different bits of policy bump into each other, if I can put it that way. And so the issue of people on benefits who may actually be in work, but the reduction of benefits meaning that they can't live where they are, and that has implications on their capacity to continue in work or to find work because they've had to move elsewhere. See what I'm saying? And
yes.
so sometimes the unforeseen consequences of bits of policy which don't necessarily connect in terms of individuals.
No, I mean, I think there is always a danger of that, and one of the things we've deliberately done is we've actually we've brought together all the ministers across Whitehall into a group to deal specifically with homelessness, but related to the fact that the benefit changes and the historic lack of supply does create a short-term pinch.
Right. I've sort of got an order in my mind from what I've seen.
Yeah, thanks. Linked to that, if that lady there is trying to move into private rented accommodation, she's probably going to have to save, even if she's got a job, £1,500. That's deposit, that's admin fees, that's a reference check. Now, you could come up with a scheme. If people coming out of a hostel, you're probably paying £200 a week for them to live in a hostel. They can't get out of those hostels, so the hostels are silted up because they cannot afford that £1,500. If you were to somehow come up with some way of subsidising that £1,500 cheap loan, paying it, you will actually save money and you will unsilt loads and loads of people from supported accommodation.
Anything else in that area? Yes? No.
Just on that, I mean, the discretionary housing program, there are at least half a dozen councils that I can think of who've got a really good localised program, which we're back funding, and that actually is helping them to be able to deliver that at a local level, because it depends on, some hostels are... Right. Okay. There is a challenge around estate agents or letting agents in this context. What we've tried to do with the discretionary housing programme is to make sure that where councils have the funding, and we're putting quite a substantial amount into that, that they have greater flexibility around that. There are several council schemes that I'm aware of that actually are doing that. I just wanted to come back to you on the hostels, though. I'm aware, obviously, that there's been a legal case which has caused some concern around this. And you were talking about the hostels silting up. Is this something that's most recent, or is this something that's obviously... Because, yeah. Yes. So if you can unblock it. You'll be paying less. Okay. No, that's a good point. They stay for 10 weeks, it comes to top. Yeah, no, quite. That's a good point. Thank you. Thank you.
There's also a supply side issue about the PRS, the private rented sector. We know that there are Christians who would like to rent, buy-to-let landlords, who'd like to rent their properties to people who are benefit claimants, so taking people out of hostels or off the street. But they're blocked either by the people that they borrowed the money from, having a clause in the mortgage saying that you can't let to people who are benefit claimants, or they're blocked by not being able to get the right sort of insurance cover. The mortgage problem is the most serious. And so if the government was able to do something to put pressure on people who lend buy-to-let mortgages to get them to remove that clause from people's buy-to-let mortgages, that would make a huge difference. That would unlock a lot of...
This has come up, and in fact, I've got a meeting with most of the major lenders on Monday, which is specifically to look at not only this issue, but some of the other issues around some of the conditions that sit on top. I mean, to be fair, one of the views we've also taken, though, is that, and I'm not against people who buy to let, that's fine, but I think we need a more balanced market. I think we need more institutional investors who are looking particularly at longer-term leases and have a longer-term perspective so that we get a better choice in tenures for people. Because although actually the average term of a lease people have in the private rented has increased, it was 15 months or so 4 or 5 years ago. It's now nearly 20 months. So the typical length of tenures is actually increasing across the whole of private rented. I want to make sure that there is more choice, particularly where we have families for whom a local school place, 2 years, causes all sorts of problems because of the squeeze around school places. So I think and we are talking to the lenders, and I've got a big meeting with them on Monday, about what conditions do they put in. But I'm also keen to make sure that we address some of the institutional investment, because if we can get a better balance, so yes, you've got the buy-to-let, that's fine, but you've also got the broader institutional investment. We'll get a bigger sector, but I think we'll get a broader sector and a higher quality as well, because they will have minimum standards in terms of what they expect from their agents and so on. But it's a good point. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Helen from Hope Housing. You said that homelessness hasn't soared. I'd like to give you a local context. In Bradford, we partner with Bradford Council with a cold weather provision. In the winter of 2011 to 2012, we had 61 people access emergency accommodation when the weather was freezing. Okay, this last winter, we had 361 people access that cold weather provision. That is people who would be sleeping outside in freezing conditions if there wasn't an emergency bed space provided for them, and that was an increase in 1,023% of bed spaces used. I think in Bradford, I think that is a massive soar in homelessness, and particularly that is rough sleeping, and I don't want you to ignore that.
No, I don't. I mean, I think I need to look at the overall picture, but I also need to look at the localised picture, and you're quite right to say, there are some really intense hotspots. One of the things we've looked at is why is it, for example, that the vast majority of B&B's problems rest around less than 20 local authorities? And so one of the things I'm looking to do now is we have an additional £2 million fund that we've identified, which I want to look at how we address that, because one of the strange things I find is when I look at the numbers, and B&B's being a good example, is you'll get two authorities next door to each other with pretty similar social issues, but substantially different numbers in B&Bs. And the question is, what is the differential? Because it isn't the social numbers, because we constantly look at that. So it's been interesting to see what that is. So I'm trying to, you're quite right, There will always be a danger in Whitehall of just taking the big picture. You have to drill down and look at what the localized issue is as well. So I take your point. I'm just trying to say that if you look at the overall numbers, certainly, for example, B&B numbers now are a third of where they were 7 or 8 years ago. Sure, yes, and I'm probably giving overly long answers.
We all have to prioritize in our lives which things come first. And it's a puzzle to me that the government has put gay marriage in preference to highlighting the needs of decent, affordable homes. And there's another point which I would like to raise, and that is that prevention is, without question, better than the disaster.
Cure, yes.
And I was with Students Exploring Marriage, and we went into schools where we were invited and asked them what was important in marriage. Oh, I've no idea. Nobody's talked to us about that. Well, one of the very big factors in homelessness is the breakup of marriage. And also the Christian faith is not given a proper place in schools and in many, and we thought that we were turned down with Students Exploring Marriage because we were a Christian organisation. So it's priorities, really, and I think that housing, decent, affordable housing, should be given high priority. Gay marriage, no, it's through now, disaster. A lot of people have backed it. But I don't understand the reasoning. What are the priorities of the Conservative Party?
Right. Well, I spend most of my time actually on housing. There has been a debate around whether or not you should have same-sex unions in marriage. I personally have no problem with the principle of same-sex unions. I was uncomfortable with the legislation personally in terms of I felt the dangers around the way in which there are open, how can I put this? The dangers is that it could be very divisive for our churches, so I personally did not support it. But don't assume that what is being reported in the newspapers reflects the daily work patterns. There has been an actual controversy about this, and understood, and there are sincerely held views on both sides. But the work of government is actually somewhat, frankly, slightly duller, but more fundamental, which is about getting homes built, and that's very much what I'm focused on. So you're right, there are priorities, and I'm certainly focused on housing.
I'm Rabina Rafferty. I ran the all-party parliamentary group on homelessness for 17 years at Westminster, and I'm delighted that you are working on trying to get institutional investors into long-term rented housing. We tried many times with Sir George Young, the first chair of the group, and others, and always failed at the last hurdle of getting the right level of inducement to the private rented sector. So best of luck on that. It's brilliant. Two very quick points. On affordability, one of the problems for the last 20 or 30 years is that we've never defined affordability. So it would be possible for you to meet your affordability targets through shared ownership and higher cost rented housing, which is very much needed, but not actually build sufficient housing for those at the very bottom who are only going to be able to move into social rented housing. And the last point, without getting into a debate about spare bedrooms, which would take longer than we've got here, the largest number of spare bedrooms are with pensioners like me. And whereas obviously no government is going to want the publicity of actually evicting elderly people from their long-term family homes, we're not doing nearly enough to provide inducements for older people to move out. There are very large numbers of people in 3, 4, 5-bedroom houses living alone. The best that they're likely to be offered, usually, is a 1-bedroom flat because they're a single person. And they want accommodation for the grandchildren, and so they won't take it up. But if you gave inducements to local authorities to be much more flexible, offer them a purpose-built 2-bedroom flat, they might well leave a 3, 4, 5-bedroom home, which would free up much more accommodation than the current bedroom subsidy.
I totally agree with you on that. Affordability, what I'm talking about, the 170,000, that's affordable homes to rent. So you're quite right, there is a general discussion. But on that last point, this is a very important issue. Now, together with Nick Bowles, the planning minister, what I have asked the officials to do now is to look at the longer-term issue. One of the key drivers of why household growth is as it is that 60% of that growth is the fact that we are all living longer, thankfully. But it's a driver of 60% of household growth. Therefore, we need to think about what that means, not just for numbers, but what kind of homes, and the financial model where we end up with people for perhaps 30 years living in the family home, rattling around, who would quite like less responsibility, but as you say, the choices aren't clear. And I think we've got some long-term thinking to do about the whole housing model, because if we could release those family homes, it really would make a difference. But you're right, getting the incentives and the choice available is a tricky one, and it's something that we are actually deliberately looking to have a look at, because I think that the House of Lords have flagged this up. It's a good issue. Sorry, yes.
Sutcliffe, Beacon and Abigail Housing in Bradford. It's a housing-related question, a very different one to the ones which have gone so far. We support asylum seekers who are seeking to resolve their asylum claims, but who are currently destitute, having been made homeless with no recourse to public funds and not allowed to work. An example of some of the people we work with are people from Iran. Some are people who were opponents of a political regime and had to flee. Some may be gay or homosexual and had to flee. Some have converted to Christianity from Islam and have been forced to flee. There is no route to return to Iran, even if these people wish to. They clearly do not wish to. They're prepared to endure destitution and significant suffering in the UK because they're frightened to death, quite literally, to return. But even if they chose to, there's no Iranian embassy, no embassy working on behalf of Iran. There is no route to them for them to be able to return. There is a current concession that if they were to show they've made significant efforts to try to return, then they could get short-term, what's called Section 4 support. People will not take that risk. They are desperate not to be able to return. But even if they did, as I say, there's no current route. The same goes for a number of other countries. There is no way out for people in this situation at the moment. And really, the question is to the Home Office or government, what should they be doing?
I don't know. I could stand here and give you some waffle, but I think I'd rather not do that. Could I perhaps ask if I can take your details and just talk to my colleagues in the Home Office, because it depends on the status of the individual asylum seeker partly, but time is pressing. But could we do that before I make sure I leave? Eva, who's sitting at the back, just get your details before I go. And if you can then drop me a note about that, and I will take that up specifically with the Home Office on your behalf. No, I'm quite happy to do that.
I'm going to take 4 more, but I'm going to take them all together.
Okay, and then I'll wrap up. Okay.
Okay, so Keith Smith from the Ferry Project based in Wisbeach. Can I just make one plug about, would you like to come and visit a rural project? So to actually see what happens. There is homelessness outside of cities. And secondly, night shelters. We're desperately trying to create a sustainable night shelter. The Holyhead decision to stop housing benefit could put that whole thing in jeopardy. I'd like to know how you're going to, attack that.
Okay.
Thank you. Liam O'Boyle, Diocese of Sutherland, Nottingham. I also help to run Nottingham Winter Shelter and various other projects around the city. Just want to pick up on one point, first of all, and from my colleague at the back talking about the situation in Bradford. In Nottingham, as well as other places represented here, I think your statement that statutory homelessness is on the increase would be disputed. We're seeing a marked increase at the moment, and that is in spite of some excellent provision of partnership work between third sector, faith sector and local authority. An example of that, at the winter shelter, we've had twice the number of people this year. Second question, please, as well, related to this. Has there been any assessment impact by government on the welfare reforms, on the impact on homelessness and potential increases? Especially with regard, we heard about relationships breaking down, debt, various other things. What we do know is that there's going to be an increase in tension as people have various issues to deal with, and those are the main causes of homelessness. So has there been any impact of that assessment, and also support for local communities? Because I know this government's very big on localism, but that's what we're about here as well.
One more back here, and then we'll...
I'm Jane Clarkson from Informal Learning. We house ex-offenders. I want to know if the government are going to do anything within the prison system so offenders are not released homeless, no benefits in place, which currently is taking 6 weeks, and now no crisis loans to bridge that gap.
Do you want to take those three, and then I'll take one more?
Yeah, sure. The last one, I mean, first, if I can. I know Chris Grayling, the Lord Chancellor, or Secretary of State for Justice, is looking specifically at that issue about the path, both what's happening in prison and then what happens in the path thereafter, trying to make sure the work habit is offered and indeed encouraged within prison before, and indeed there are issues around literacy and other that are very important, but then looking at that path, so as you say, the danger we've had, let's be honest, for many years now, where people arrive outside the prison gates and the support is not actually relevant to them. So he's having a specific look at that. In terms of Nottingham, on the impact in terms of the welfare changes, yes, we're deliberately and consciously monitoring any of these changes, as you would expect. It's quite difficult at this early stage because a fair number of them certainly aren't nationally implemented yet. What we're trying to do is monitor them at a local level and then build that up as we go so we can see what that underlying impact is. And then in terms of Keith and Wisbech, your MP, actually, Steve Barclay, has been bending my ear on this issue. He's already actually extended an invitation for me to come to Wisbech. I am planning to come up to your part of the world. Whether it'll be specifically Wisbech, we haven't quite sorted out, because he's highlighted a number of housing challenges in Wisbech and indeed some local, how shall I put this nicely, antisocial behaviour plus issues, which I'm well aware of, and I think that's a really important issue. And I think it flags up this point about rural communities as well, which is there's a habit perhaps, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody, of thinking that it's all about wonderful Bradford, but also Sheffield, Leeds, Manchester, wherever. But actually, I often feel that if you're in an area that otherwise is regarded as generally leafy and prosperous, if you do have a problem, you're in some ways more isolated than those where the statistics actually, I live in leafy East Hertfordshire. Now the souls who are in difficulties there, because we're a generally prosperous area, in many ways far more isolated than they are in Harlow or North London, because they don't count. The statistics only go down to a certain level. So it's a really, really good point on that one. You mentioned just about and this is a legal case around a shelter in Anglesey. Our understanding, and I'm not a lawyer in this context, is that the judge was quite clear that this was about the individual circumstances related to that shelter, that the principle is as long as a shelter is a dwelling, and most of them fall into that category, there shouldn't be any impact in terms of the housing benefit. But we are monitoring the situation because there are some that may fall into that, and we just want to get some clarity, but you're right, I'm aware of the legal risks. But on the rural point, absolutely, and you may yet come to regret inviting me to come and see you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yes, one last one. Okay.
Right, hello, my name's Jenny Rossiter and I'm a trustee of Housing Justice. I'm very pleased that you mentioned subsidy because everything government does depends on the use of subsidy. But I read with great alarm in the housing press last week that the sale of council houses has the right to, under the right to buy, which you now give a 70% subsidy for people to buy, is soaring. And I find there's a sort of disjuncture here why trying to get people into smaller houses through the bedroom tax, but at the same time encouraging at 70% discount the sale of council houses. And if you look at the global way subsidy is spent, the sale of council houses makes absolutely no sense. And I'm sure you've heard all these arguments before, but in these times when we're so desperate for good, affordable housing, it seems to make no sense at all. These houses had public subsidy to be built. They had public subsidy to be consumed in the form of housing benefit. They have public subsidy in the discount. And sometimes they have public subsidy because the people who buy them have got to have their mortgage changed to rents, and this is a program that housing associations run, and they get a subsidy for that as well. So there's sometimes 4 lots of subsidy that have gone in to this program of selling council houses.
Okay. I take your point, although housing isn't all about subsidy, and in fact, in the days, I'm afraid, and in an age from now on, as indeed the Labour Party has said themselves, as well as we have, we've got to recognise that actually we've got to be smarter about this. But in terms of right to buy, for me it's about a principle, which is that just because you live in a council house, you shouldn't be denied the opportunity to buy your own home. And that's a very important principle. But what we are doing, and what I think we didn't do it in the 1980s, and I think we were wrong, is that we are recycling the additional receipts back so that we're actually reinvesting in the housing stock. And that, I think, will help. But I can see we don't agree on the principles. That's fair enough. I just feel very strongly that there's a certain group of people in that context who should not be denied that right. That's the point.
Thank you, Minister, very much. I think we've got about 15 questions in there. There were at least another 15 waiting, and I'm really sorry to those who didn't have the opportunity, but time is a supreme with your timetable, I know. So can we thank you very much for both speaking to us and for responding to our questions. I think one of the pluses of an occasion like this, and why we're grateful to you for coming, is that people see you, as it were, face to face, and therefore feel that they've had the chance to communicate. And I suspect you may not have heard the last from one or two here, not least those who might not have had the opportunity to address a question to you in particular. And so be warned, there may be communications coming your way, and obviously some of us are going to have contact with you in other contexts as well when you visit Wisbech or wherever it happens to be. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.